Hi everyone, welcome to GBE Reviews. I'm your host Joe, and today I'm going to be talking about my personal favorite visual novel, Tsukihime, which basically translates to Lunar Princess. Alright, so I'm going to give you a bit of background for those who haven't heard of Tsukihime. Tsukihime was released in late 2000 by developer Type Moon. Even if you haven't read or even heard of Tsukihime, it's likely you have heard of Type Moon's extremely popular visual novel/anime franchise Fate Stay Night. There have been several rumors of a Tsukihime re-release happening in the future, the most recent being a discussion with the creators in July 2015, along with some teaser photos released with the article in Type Moon's monthly magazine, Type Moon Ace. So long story short, there are plans in the works for a Tsukihime re-release, but it will likely take a backseat to continued anime iterations of Fate Stay Night until it stops making so much money. Alright, moving on with the actual review, let's start with story. The story centers around Shiki Tono, who is a high school student who develops mystical powers which drive the majority of the narrative. The story covers his life in school along with his interaction with each of the 5 main heroines of the story, along with several other characters. The overall theme of the story is dark. It has dark themes and covers disturbing plot elements such as insanity, death, murder, and rape. That being said, I found there was a great balance between horror and romance. The story was well balanced given its dark themes. One thing that is extremely important is how a story develops over time. In that regard, Tsukihime is a masterpiece. It has excellent pacing in both each respective arc and the overall story. Something unique about Tsukihime is that each of the arcs reveals more information about Shiki and his backstory. Even through the last of the 5 arcs, you will still learn more things about Shiki. They'll explain things that happened in prior arcs and make you want to replay them. I do have to admit though, there are some pieces of the story that confused me on my first playthrough. I had to reread it again before I completely understood. So the story is definitely complex. You need to pay attention in some cases if you want to completely understand all the backstory. Each of the arcs has 2 endings, which are roughly a good and a normal, though that isn't always the case. The endings are done very well and feel complete and satisfying. Alright, moving on to sound. Tsukihime is interesting in that it is quite old and very simplistic in its design. There are no voice actors, and the soundtrack is fairly sparse, as in there are only 10 tracks to cover the entire visual novel, and 2 of the 10 are an intro and outro song you only hear once each arc. That being said, there are actually 2 versions of the soundtrack, the original and a remake from 2000 entitled Ever After, music from Tsukihime reproduction. This remake features new versions of most of the songs, which are cleaned up and generally sound more full and complete, though I must admit there's definitely a little bit of charm to the original soundtrack as well. Here are the 2 versions of track 7 to give you an idea of the difference between the 2. Here are a few more tracks I like in particular that I think you guys will enjoy as well. In general, I find the soundtrack enhances the mood of the story and sets a pretty good backdrop. One interesting thing about Tsukihime is how simple it is to modify the soundtrack. You can either use the original soundtrack or the Ever After version, or just a mix of the two. All you need to do is replace the files in the CD folder of the game with the version that you'd like to use, following the naming convention. You should be good to go. In fact, I bet you could replace the original game soundtrack with basically any song and they would likely play, though I'm not 100% sure about that. Alright, next let's talk about the art. The art is definitely the major drawback of Tsukihime. The art was done in the early 2000s, you can definitely tell. Also, the way the character is designed is very distinct to Type Moon's artist. You can definitely tell Fate Stay Night and Tsukihime are drawn by the same artist. The backgrounds tend to be fairly monotone and focus on a lot of shades of blue. I do find the simplified backgrounds work well with the text and everything is easy to read. There are a few instances where the backgrounds are extremely dark and gruesome, and do a great job of playing into the overall dark theme of the visual novel. So wrapping up, let's talk about characters quickly. I'm not going to go into all that much detail about each particular character. Part of the joy of reading this visual novel is getting to know each of the characters and how they interact with Shiki and each other. One thing I will say is, each of the characters has an excellent character development arc, and they all change substantially based on their interactions with Shiki. Seeing a character in her own arc as compared to another character's arc makes a huge difference, and you can see how different interactions with Shiki shape each of them differently. Alright, so now let's answer the number one most important question. Should you read this visual novel? Let's review some of the good and bad elements of Tsukihime, and who should read this visual novel based on them. Alright, so the kind of people who would like Tsukihime, aka the good. Do you enjoy unique and dark stories, and have a good attention for detail? Do you like watching a story develop over time and learning more about the story and universe over each arc? Do you like a long and involved story that gives you many different choices and the possibility to get several bad endings? Alright, now let's talk about the kind of people who would dislike Tsukihime, aka the bad. Do you prefer voice acting and high production values? Are you uncomfortable with dark story elements including insanity, death, rape, or just horror in general? Do you dislike a forced playthrough order? Do you tend to only like a single playthrough of a visual novel and then stop? In summary, if you would like a deep story and aren't afraid of below average production value and dark themes, you should definitely read Tsukihime. Otherwise, you may want to pass or consider waiting for the re-release, which will likely clean up most of the issues with the original. Well, that's pretty much it. Hopefully you found this review helpful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of GBE Reviews. Again, I'm your host Joe, saying to you, Jane.
Oh, please don't let me